So I'm talking here today with David Zetland, water economist, and we're talking about drought in California and other US states. David, can we attribute the severity of the recent droughts to climate change?
Gosh, that's a great question for a scientist. I'm not, so I'm going to say yes, because I'll tell you the bad news is that if this is climate change and it's going to get worse in the future, then we're really in trouble. The good news is that we always have needed to deal with droughts, and climate change is going to, say that you don't think climate change is happening. Say that you're in this interesting minority of people. And I say to you, we should manage water more efficiently. You'll say, but climate change isn't happening. I'll say, we should do it anyway. And in that sense, it's a good idea to manage water in a more wise way. Uh, in climate change discussions, there's mitigation, which means putting less carbon and other CO2 equivalents in the atmosphere to reduce the forcing that is causing global warming and therefore climate change. But then climate change, when it arrives in the hydrological cycle. It arrives in droughts, it arrives in storms and hurricanes and unbelievable rainstorms and so on. And so adaptation to climate change requires dealing with the water cycle. It requires dealing with water. And we will always have to deal with water. We have been for thousands of years. And climate change is not going to change that fact. It's just going to make it more relevant. So if climate change is happening and the drought is one of the signs of climate change happening, then we're going to have to deal with less water. If climate change is happening and the drought is not a sign of climate change is going to make it even worse in the future, then we need to deal with water. If climate change is not happening, then we need to deal with water. So one way or the other, we still need to deal with water. Climate change is only making that discussion more relevant.
One of the things that people talk about, concepts that people talk about in terms of climate change adaptation in developing countries, is this idea of the adaptation deficit, where you're not in a position to be able to respond to the climate variability that is associated with the current climate, and that should be a priority before trying to look into the future. In terms of policy in the US, do you think that it is more important to prioritize responses towards the current drought, current climate variability, rather than looking forward to the future?
Wow, great question. I would say that the current drought, in many people's minds, is a form of an emergency, and that requires kinds of emergency steps. Some of those steps are probably not going to be so wise. So if we empty a reservoir so we can finish growing cantaloupe so that people can have cantaloupe for, $3 a melon instead of $6 a melon, I'm not sure that's a good idea, because we might want that reservoir later on for drinking water. But what did you call it? Adaptability?
Adaptation deficit.
So the United States absolutely does have, and it varies from place to place, but I know of many examples of an adaptation deficit, more or less because the systems were built around the expectation of almost unlimited water. Even in places like Oregon and Washington State and in British Columbia up in Canada, they are running into the end of unlimited water, which is a real shocker. And they have an adaptation deficit right there because they don't know literally how to turn off the valve, right? It's like those fountains in Rome that don't turn off. They run 24/7, and they have for 2,000 years. And that should be okay as long as the water is at the spring, right? On the other hand, what's unfortunate from a political and a social perspective is that people are willing to put in a lot of work to deal with a problem when they're in the middle of a crisis. So, this expression, don't ever let a crisis go to waste. So the West is in a drought. Everybody's talking about, let's use different technology to reduce water evaporation. They're talking about we have to tear out crops. We have to not grow our lawns. There's all kinds of policy discussions going on. If it starts to rain again, then people will stop doing that and turn away and go do something else. So there is an opportunity to turn the drought into not just short-term damage control, but also long-term amelioration of the adaptation deficit to fill that gap. Americans tend not to be very good at that in terms of filling the gaps. The never again kind of mentality usually evaporates within about 2 weeks because some other emergency comes up. But it would be good to deal with that because then some states would, you would have less damage from a drought. So you could see this in some countries. In my book, I compared Copenhagen in Denmark to Barcelona in Spain, and I said, look, water in Barcelona is cheaper than it is in Denmark. That must be a sign of really good operations management because they're delivering cheaper water. And then I said, but wait, Barcelona ran out of water about 5 years ago, and they had to have ships come with water so people could drink water. They were out of water completely. Whereas Copenhagen has never run out of water. So sometimes you have to pay more to get better quality, and Denmark had no adaptation deficit. Barcelona had a huge deficit, and that's the kind of thing we have to think about in terms of closing the gaps and preparing for more variability in water flows. Long answer, sorry.
No, that's okay. And in terms of particularly in terms of California, how do you see changes in snowmelt becoming a real issue, and what is the answer to that? Is it to build more dams to store more of the runoff, or are there other solutions?
I would. So the quip is that if you have a dam that has no water behind it, it's fairly useless, right? So if the snowpack in California literally disappears, either because it shifts more to the north, so there's no snow at all, or it evaporates more quickly, so it doesn't stay on the ground so long and melt and then show up in August, which is very convenient for water users. If the snowpack is disappearing and the water is falling and moving more quickly, then you definitely want to be able to hold and store water for later use, and the number of dams and the volume of dams required to hold as much water that rests on the Sierra Nevada would be extraordinary. I'm not sure that would be beneficial from a financial perspective or even from a water management perspective. But it does point out that I would say two big trends are going to come out in California from a reduction in snowpack. One is more use of aquifers for storing water underground because they're cheap and they're cheaper than dams, and they're more reliable in terms of storage. And the other one is that Californians will lose some industries, mostly agricultural, that will not have enough water, and they'll change the way they use water because what little water is left will be more expensive, either because the cost of building a bunch of dams shows up in your water bill, or because there's markets for water and people are fighting over it in the marketplace and the price has gone up. So I would guess that water consumption in California will drop, guess what, towards levels that are closer to Australian levels, which is roughly, what's it, around 200 liters per person per day or so in places like Canberra and Sydney.
Yeah.
And it got down under 200, down to 150s, 160s in the middle of the Great Australian Drought. And California the per capita consumption is, in San Francisco, maybe it's 200 liters or so, but in Los Angeles, it's more like 300 or 400 liters per capita. So if you drop that in half, then you can either use half the water you were, or you could have double the number of people, or whatever you want to call it. But basically, lifestyle's got to change.
We talk, coming back to our early discussion, and you were talking about the need for reform and being able to seize the opportunity of the drought in terms of enacting longer-term reform. Can you see the drought in California and other US states becoming a real political issue?
Sorry, can we see the drought becoming a real what?
A political issue.
Oh, gosh. Well, yes, I've got this construction noise outside. Sorry. So can the drought become a political issue? I think, yes, it is, because more or less people who are being affected by the drought go to politicians and say, remove this problem, remove this drought. Give me money. I'm losing money because I'm a farmer. Bring more water. I need to water my lawn, so you should build a nuclear-powered desalination plant, or start a war with the Mexicans because they're taking too much water. There's all kinds of claims that people will make that more or less are shortcuts for them to reduce their pain. If you don't have a government bailing you out, you don't have a paternalistic government or a nanny state, then they would say, hey, you've got less water, deal with it. We're not going to invade the neighbors. They're dealing with their own problems. And you have to pay for the water you're using, for example. So those, people will always want to be bailed out. They will always want to have free stuff that other people are paying for in other locations. And so they will make those political claims, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. A drought or any other part of the water cycle, or any other part of supply and demand, requires that you live within your means, and pretending that you don't have to is irresponsible.
And it sounds a little bit as though the examples that you gave of the types of lobbying which is occurring and will continue to go on, it doesn't sound very constructive in terms of longer-term water security.
No, it's a disaster. I left the United States. I moved to the Netherlands because I wanted to be among adults in terms of these political debates. And the United States, from a federal level, has got huge issues in terms of the two political parties. Those issues are not necessarily gone when you get to local and state levels. And there's a lot of people who have adopted a political rhetoric, which is, give me mine and give me yours, and I won an election, and that's how I can do this. It's terribly immature, the political rhetoric from the United States is I don't know. I'm sorry that Australia is now starting to catch up with Abbott and his great war on the environment, as well as in Canada. So maybe it is a worldwide thing. You can find examples of politicians who are torn between what they're told they need to do in terms of climate change or science or water supplies, and citizens who basically won't put up with that. They won't put up with less. And this is an interesting, big philosophical question that gets at consumerism, it gets at population growth, it gets at the fear of China, the rise of China, or is China going to take our stuff? And from my perspective, living within your means is a nicer way to talk about all of us on the earth sharing what we've got in terms of resources, in terms of the environment, in terms of our economic activities. But it seems like a lot of people have grown up with gimme, 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 and they're not necessarily ready to step away from that kind of dramatic, non-negotiable position.